What's up, YouTube? In today's video, we're going to be looking at using Ngrok with the ASP.NET Core application, but more specifically, we're going to be looking at using or working with the Alexa natural language processing feature, which is, in other words, you can talk to an Alexa device, or even if you don't have a device, there's an online website you can go to on Amazon that can simulate the device. So if you don't have one, you can still play along here because the device itself doesn't have to exist. You need a microphone attached to your PC so you can speak into it. But other than that, there's no actual device required. But if you do have a device and an account, you can just do this whole application for yourselves. So I suggest strongly, if you haven't played with Alexa, then just do this simple piece, and then of course from that point.
Speaking of time, this might be a good time to connect with someone you care about. Just ask me to make a call.
There's one device here which I actually muted, but there's another one in the room in the back, and she picked it up. Okay. What I suggest is, just as an exercise and as a learning process, if you haven't played with Alexa, or even if you have built applications in the past, go down this route. That'll take you step by step, and then you should be able to get moving forward from that point forward. You can build an entire Alexa application, and then you're only left with the deployment part of it, right? So before you can start on the Alexa side, as in on the Amazon side, you need an Amazon account. It could be, if you have a Prime account, that's fine too. It doesn't matter. If you already have an Amazon account, you simply have to go to the developers page on Amazon and basically sign in, and it'll ask you for the same credentials. So the same credentials work everywhere. And then you can start to build an application from scratch, or a skill, as we call it in Alexa. But that's one of the ways you can build an application. So we'll be working with the Alexa NLP system, which is the natural language processing system, which is online. And it will eventually, after it's processed our language, the spoken word, it can call into our application, and we're going to use Ngrok to get it to call into our local machine. Right? That's the cool part. When I first developed my Alexa applications, I was not aware of Ngrok or any such thing, or maybe I just didn't bother looking into the possibilities. And so it was a very tedious process to build and debug a skill, because there's so many unknowns and there's so many variations, and you want to try different things. And for every time you try something, you have to make a little change on a local machine, and without being able to test it for the most part. Of course, over a period of time, I did develop my own little way of doing the testing locally before pushing the code up there. But basically, the way Amazon kind of makes it happen is write the code locally, push it up onto their websites, test it. Something not working, try and figure out blindly without any debugging tools at your disposal what's happening, and then do the same, repeat, right? It's a very tedious process. So this will be a good exercise for those who built and had a either successful or not so successful experience, found it very tedious. And for those who never tried it, this is definitely a nice place to kind of start. All right. Okay, so I'm going to start with a simple out-of-the-box ASP.NET Core application with no modification. Then we'll start modifying it. Okay, so I'm starting with a simple ASP.NET Core application, Web API application. Leave that for now. And Web API. In this case, I'm using 3.1, so make sure you're doing the same, or make sure you understand I'm using .NET Core 3.1. So in case there are changes or differences, you'll need to account for that. Okay, and then we also want to start up Ngrok once we have the the port numbers here for this application. So if I run this application here, I'm going to change that weather forecasting. No, I don't want that. So the port is, the secure port is 44302. But let me also make some changes here to the controller names and such, so we don't end up stuck with this weather stuff. I'm going to call this the Alexa intent controller. Yeah, I should be uppercase. Alexa intent controller. So that becomes Alexa intent controller. So the default URL in our application should be Alexa intent And we don't need the get. I'll leave the get there. Just remove this stuff for now. This we can just test with the get. But I'll take out all this code. I don't want any of this stuff, and I don't want any of this stuff here. All right. Okay. We'll also define a new HTTP post method, since Alexa is going to be doing the post on our application. And so we need to test that. And we'll be returning something. For now, I'm just going to leave it as an async. Well, I don't know about async. So let's for now just leave it as void. And this will be, I'll just call it post. It doesn't really matter what the name is, because Alexa is going to send us JSON. And in ASP.NET Core, there's no way to receive JSON as a unknown thing right off the bat, just kind of without knowing what the structure is, unless you say you have no arguments to this method. So we have no arguments to our post method, and of course the HTTP post. And then we will have to extract from the body directly ourselves the JSON, which is what we're going to do here now. So we have the request.body, which is a stream, which means I'll need a stream reader. So I'll say new stream reader that takes a stream as an argument, input constructor argument, and I'll call that stream reader. And this I'll use the using expression here. So once I have the stream reader, I should be able to read to end the entire stream. This is not the best way to do it, but just need a quick win here. Why is there the read to end not a good way? Because in case the JSON is huge, which actually in Alexa's case is pretty a large chunk of JSON, you're unnecessarily allocating all this memory. There's already memory, right? The fact that the body has a stream, that memory is already allocated. By doing read to stream, you now have two chunks of the same size memory, both eventually to be garbage collected. So it's not the ideal way to read large streams. You should be kind of reading, chunks of bytes when you're doing that, but I'm just doing it for the short thing here. Okay, so the idea is that when I first start up the Alexa NLP thing, eventually I'd like to point it to let's call it a webhook. It's going to have a webhook. They don't call it a webhook. They can call some endpoint that has been HTTPS endpoint. We'll point it to our sort of the Ngrok provided endpoint. That'll come into this application here. And in that JSON, there's going to be information about the words we spoke, because when we create the intent, we're going to provide for parameters in the sentences or expressions. For example, let's say I'm building an intent where I want Alexa to explain value types and reference types, which is what we're going to actually do today, but just have a little bit of fun there. So I would say things like, ask so-and-so application to explain value types. So value types becomes the sort of the placeholder, like the parameterized portion, because then I can say explain reference types. And so within expressions that you speak spoken words, you can determine certain placeholders. They call them slots. And each slot could have either it's just a variable, like something completely unknown, or a list of possible values. So in our case, because reference types and value types are the only ones we want to support, we will define the slot that says there is a reference type and a value type possible option. So when somebody says reference type, it means reference type. And when somebody says value type, it means value type. It also makes it easier for the natural language processing to sort of fill in the blanks, because it can understand the words. Okay, that definitely was a reference type, right? So the slots are essentially our parameters, and each of those parameters have a name, but they also have a value. So we can define the name of the parameter. It's kind of like a function call. We say, okay, here's a name. Let's call it, variable type. And its value would be reference type or value type, as far as Alexa is concerned, once it's parsed out the language. All right. Even though that's not the point of this discussion, I'm not trying to teach you how to build an Alexa application. It's certainly valuable for you to understand what I'm saying. Of course, I'm not going in the normal way of trying to explain everything about Alexa to you. So I understand the focus really on building the application, right? So if you have your own application that, let's say, an Azure monitor alert, then you will follow the same steps, right? You will first get that JSON. Then you see the events, and you're trying to determine what the differences are in the different JSONs you might get for the different events, and produce C# DTOs that match those JSON structures, and then keep debugging and building out your application. But then you can use Ngrok to do that. You don't have to keep going back to your alert to have it call back or hook into your application over and over again for you to continue the debugging experience. Okay, so let's head on over to my Alexa console, as they call it. It's not a console, it's a web application, and take a look at what I have here. Okay, so I have a skill that I've developed. I've called the skill, but it doesn't matter what it's called. Its invocation name is C#. Right? Even though I could say it as just the letter C and sharp. Either way, I've called it C#. And it has been lowercase and stuff. There's various other requirements here you might want to read about. Once you have the skill, you have to define intents. Now, by default, as soon as you create a skill, certain intents are already created. And that is over here. You see there's 5 intents, even though I have only created 1 intent. In other words, there are these built-in intents, 4 of them, for cancel and help and stop and all that. But this is my intent. This is one intent that we're working on now. So the name of the intent is what is variable type intent. And then the sample utterances that I've defined are things like, tell me about, and I'm expecting here to see value type or reference type. Ask, so the way it goes is, say, hey, Alexa, ask C# to, right? So you're basically saying, in your mind, you're saying, ask C# to, and then something. So that has to flow, or how would you say it if you had to say, ask C#, blah, blah, blah. So ask C# to tell me about value types or reference types. Ask C# to explain value types, reference types. Ask C# about value types, reference types. Ask C# what a value type is, or what a reference type is. What is a value type? What is a reference type? So you can have as many of these utterances as you have, the more the merrier. Accounts for various possibilities. But that's not to say that's the only phrases it will learn. As you use that model more and more, that model starts to learn. And then there's a way in your Alexa app on the phone, if she didn't do the right thing, you can actually go in this and say, it didn't do the right thing. You were expecting this, but it did that or something. So you can help the model learn more and more. And this C# variable types is then a slot that I've defined here by this name. And the slot has possible values, value type and reference type. Right? So that's really what it was. So and then you can add synonyms. You can have, maybe there's different names or words for the same thing. So you can specify those as well. But basically, this has only 2 possible values, reference type and value type. So it's almost like an enum of sorts. So there's a separate enum concept in Alexa as well. But this is just the 2 possible values. But this is how this works. The intent has the placeholder. The placeholder could be just some value. Maybe you don't know what to expect. So it could just be some string and you just want to know what that person said in that position. Or you have possible placeholders, parameters, if you will, that the natural language processing can then parse your spoken word and sort of fit in the values. When you get that JSON in your application, it's this massive JSON, but in there are these values of those parameters, the parameter names and the parameter values. And so I'm not using the Alexa SDK. There's an SDK that does all that heavy lifting for you. I'm going simply down to the raw metal JSON and parsing it out and kind of showing you that. But of course, if you want, you can use the Alexa SDK. I don't know if they have a C# SDK. They probably have a C# SDK, but I'm never impressed with whatever Amazon does so far, or Google for that matter, at the developer level. But I have used Alexa's the Node.js SDK, and that's pretty decent. If the C# one is similar, then that'll be pretty cool. So all my applications in my Alexa application, I've got about 7, 8 of them. They all use Node.js and TypeScript. But only because at the time I was publishing them to Amazon's Lambda, which is the sort of the function equivalent of Azure. And because I was learning this process at the time, I didn't want too many hiccups. I want to just get stuff working. But then once I got the one working and I got used to that pattern, if you will, I just continued on. And I think that's one of the problems we have as people. Once we get used to the pattern, we think that's simple. We forgot that the pattern itself is actually fairly tedious. Okay, so the idea is that, and you can test this here. Once you have this model, you need to build the model, everything else. I won't go through all that process. I'm not trying to teach you how to build an actual intent, but then you have the option to test here. And when you do the testing here, you could either speak or type your thing here, right? And when you do that, you can sort of manually test. So this is the other way I was saying, if you don't have an actual device, you can speak it and test it here and build. It'll be exactly like as if the actual device sort of came from there. So there's no difference. So without an actual device, you can actually build an entire application. And there's another website, I think it's called, I forget the name of the thing. I'll see if I can find it and put it in the show notes below. It's basically all you have is like a simulated device, and uses your computer speaker or mic, not speaker, mic, and you can talk, and it basically does the same thing. So it's as if it were a device, right? So either ways you can do the testing. So here I could say something like, ask C# to explain reference types. I can do that. I can type it in. What I need to do now is, I won't do this actually. Let me just go back to the build here, because I've not set up one thing. One of the things I need here, if you look at this same C# skill, C# skill, there's an endpoint feature, and the endpoint feature is taking an HTTPS endpoint, and of course this URL is no longer valid, the Ngrok URL. So I need to start up Ngrok since I've shut it down. I need to provide that command line, which is HTTPS. And I need I've got the port number, 44307, was it? I'll keep this running since we'll need this to be running. 02. That's the, oh, hang on. We'll also probably change the launch settings. So we call this Alexa intent, right? Alexa intent. So here, we're going to call this Alexa intent. And the same thing here. Okay, in case we use that feature. All right, let's try it. Okay, so the port number, in case you can't see that, is 4430, right? 44302, sorry. Okay, 44302, that's the port. And then we also have to set up the host header. So header equals, again, localhost colon 44302. Right. So we're using the secured port. We are setting up the HTTPS to come to this point, and also the host header also needs to be localhost, and so on and so on. So we set up that Ngrok endpoint. We use or copy this HTTP version of the endpoint, because we'll have to tag on the Alexa intent there. Go back to our thing here, and what we do is we do Ngrok / Alexa intent. Right? We save that. Make sure we save it. Where does it save? All right, that is saved. So now if you were to go and do the testing part here, so I'm in my head, I'm saying, hey, Alexa, ask C#. So ask C# to explain reference types. Right? So I could speak this using a microphone that's connected to my computer, or I can type it in. It's a tedious interface, because once you say it, there's no way to kind of repeat it, Either you copy it, and if you do a voice thing, you can't say just repeat the same voiceover. You have to keep saying it. So it's a very tedious way of doing it, but there's better ways to do that. So that's what Ngrok gives us. All right. So I'm going to hit OK here. Hit enter. And we're expecting that our application is going to hit this breakpoint in our application. So it's going to come here, right, as a breakpoint. So let's see if that theory is correct. No content. So it didn't see anything here. Oh, well, C# is correct. So let me try it with the actual device. So I'm speaking into the actual device. Alexa, ask C# to explain reference types. Oh, there it is. It came and stopped here. And the idea here is now to see this JSON. So this is like a lot of JSON here. Okay, can't do synchronous operations. Okay, why don't you just tell me this before? It's the point of a compiler, right? I mean, if you can't, I don't understand this thing in .NET Core. I mean, I understand why they would do that, but why can't it be, why not just remove these synchronous features or something? I don't know. The compiler needs to be a bit smarter. I hate the runtime issues. Okay, so basically it says I need to do the read to end async. And therefore I need to await it here. That means I need to return a task instead of void, and I need to mark this method as async and return a task. Okay. So that is, and I didn't hear Alexa say or complain about anything. So, okay, so the app is running, and I'm going to speak into, let me just unwind this a bit. It's going to all curl up. Alexa, ask C# to explain reference types. There it is. And this time we have this JSON, right? So this JSON is, now we don't understand it yet. We don't know how it's going to look or what to extract and where's the values that we're looking for and all that. So now we're going to let that go. And she might not respond because she needs to be given back a response. Okay, so that's all documented. It's very well documented. It's just difficult to find. But we'll have the code, and if you want, you can just start there. But so now that we have the JSON, one of the things that Ngrok provides, if you remember from the, oh, by the way, I know you mentioned this. There's a prerequisite to this video, which is to watch the previous video I made on Ngrok itself and ASP.NET Core. I'll put a link to that here. So I sort of skip that whole process with the assumption you watch that video before you watch this one. There's a local application that the Ngrok server surfaces. So let's go there. So that's localhost :4040. And it shows us all of the different requests that I've hit so far. So we see these two, and we're also seeing the JSON that came in, right? And the response. Okay, we didn't respond to anything, but this is the whole thing. And there's a button here that says replay. So let's say these two were totally different intents. Let's say in one I said reference type, and the other one, when I was speaking into Alexa, I was saying value type. You'll see those values here, or there are things here. So this says like value types, values, reference types. And that's the variable, if you remember the slot. So that's how we're going to extract the data. So we know what the intent was. That was the intent. That was, see, we only spoke into Alexa. Alexa determines what the intent was. So we said ask C#. So it's in that skill. In that skill, my phrasing was this. And so it matched that phrasing to this intent. And then from in the intent is matching it to the parameters and so on, right? So it's doing a lot of that heavy lifting for us, converting or understanding human spoken languages into parameters, function calls, right, at the end of the day. So that's what we're getting at. Okay. So now the question is, how do we get all this JSON? Of course, we have in C# a way to just copy all this JSON and ask the Visual Studio IDE to construct C# classes out of this stuff. So I've already done that. And there's also a response to Alexa. So it's not, you can't respond, you have to respond with the speech. I mean, you say, hey, Alexa, ask C# to explain what reference types are. Well, that response has to come by way of another object that's part of the Alexa SDK, if you will, documentation. So I've done all of that. All right. So the aim was just to show you up to this part, but I've done all of that. So you can see this in action. So let's take a look at that. All right. So what I've done is, essentially, I've used all that copy paste of the JSON request to produce what I call Alexa request object here. There's a ton of other objects, sub-objects, and then dig into those objects to get at the intent, and then digging into the objects to get at the values and so on. So I've done all of that code. And then there's an Alexa response object as well. And using that JSON I then construct the C# JSON Alexa response objects, and then I fill in the values there before I return the actual response. So that's all over here. Earlier we had the code up to this JSON thing. I changed our task returning to now be returning an Alexa response object. And then I use the JSON serializer to serialize the JSON to an Alexa request object. Once you have these, the intent can be determined by the Alexa request.intent.name. Okay, none of these are under my control. These are all coming straight out of the JSON. So the objects have been named like this. I've just left them alone. And then based on the intent, which is either I only have the one intent. So if this is one intent, then I have a method that says process the event. If it's some other intent, I don't know what it is. I just throw an exception. So coming to the process, what is variable type event intent? I set this variable to unknown. And then because I had some issues here, but may not need it any longer. And that's one of those things with refactoring your code. You might do things just while you're developing, but once you've done that, you're going to go through the whole process again and say, "Will I ever need this? Will this feature ever occur? Sorry, this not feature. This scenario ever occur? Would I ever need this variable again?" And so on. Right? You need to kind of go back and clean up. So my Alexa request.intent. If it's not null, then I know to move forward here. And then I could dig into the slots. I dig into that C# variable type slots. I look at the resolution, blah, blah, blah. Basically what I'm getting at is what does it sort of parse that variable type to? Did I say value type or did I say reference type? And based on that, this value here, this variable type here will be either value type or reference type. And of course, these are not spoken words. If you remember the slots here that we had in our Alexa app, we said if it matches this, then this is a variable type. The name of the value, if you will, is variable type, right? That's the value. It's not free form text in that sense. So it'll always give us this or that based on how it figures out what it is. So what the person might have said. So if it's a value type, we'll say this, and if it's a reference type, we'll say that. So now we're going to go run this application. So you can see if I say reference type, it says the reference type is simpler to understand since it's just a reference to an actual blah, 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 right? So let's run this application. I've not made any changes to the Alexa thing. The endpoint is still pointing to the same Ngrok URL, which is the same. We have not stopped or rerun Ngrok. It's coming to the same application and pointing to this C# application here. And I'm going to just put a breakpoint on that value type. So we know for a fact that it's hitting this endpoint or this specific thing for reference types. All right, here goes. Alexa, ask C# to explain reference types. There it is, and I'm going to hit run.
A reference type is simpler to understand since it's just a reference to an actual memory location on the global heap. But that's as far as I can go.
This is all intentionally. Don't like I want to spend all time just trying to explain to you reference types, but I'm having some fun here. So we're now going to ask her to tell us what she thinks about value types, right? And I'm intentionally not showing you what I have there. So I'm going to ask her about that. Alexa, ask C# to explain value types.
A value type is A. Well, I'm not sure. Let me ask Matthew. Matthew.
A value type is something to do with stacks and heaps, but I've never really figured out stacks and heaps of what exactly.
Can you believe it?
Okay. So, the thing is, what I'm getting at is I would never be messing around and playing with this stuff if I had to keep deploying my application to Amazon just to kind of see the different variations, right? So the tediousness and the difficulty with debugging and having to upload this application each time I make a tweak to the server just to see the effect is preventing you from doing that experimentation as well. So between Ngrok giving you the ability to replay, so I can now replay that without even calling Alexa, right? But it's not going to respond to Alexa. It's not like I'm going to hear Alexa speaking out, but I can check the response and I can keep playing with that, making sure it's all okay. And then I can deploy that application to Alexa, or I can call using that test application. I'm not sure why that test app didn't work. It's always been flaky. It's nothing new. Amazon stuff is not reliable. So I'll say ask C# to explain value types. Let's see. Maybe next time I'll try and speak into it. Let me remove these breakpoints here. Yeah, breakpoints are removed. No comment. Let me try speaking into this. Oh, actually, you know what? That's not what I need to do. I need to hit enter here. Sorry. See, that's the problem. It's the same thing accepts audio, but if you're typing, you have to hit enter and not click the mic button. Sorry, Amazon. I was blaming your UI. It does still suck, by the way, but that was my mistake. Okay, let's try this.
A value type is A. Well, I'm not sure. Let me ask Matthew. Matthew.
A value type is something to do with stacks and heaps, but I've never really figured out stacks and heaps of what exactly.
Can you believe it?
Yeah. So see, it's returning or responding with the text that I provided, because you're hearing the text part, you're not seeing the response. And here is the actual response you're seeing, and this is the response. And this is basically what I did is I copied this from here, and that's why I got the response. And that's the actual JSON that I sent back to Alexa. So in this format, that's what an Alexa response implies and or looks like. And I don't know if you guys can see this. Let me zoom this in a little bit. There. Yeah. Oops. Okay. So, but it's all documented. But you could use this to get the request and the response if you wanted. But the other way to do this would be to use Ngrok. So you can test out your application locally. You can still check to see if you get this JSON back, right? So every time I hit the Ngrok website, let's try that here. The local application, oh, we lost that. So let's do that again. Localhost 4040. That was the last one. So we can see the request here, and then we can see the response as well, right? That's the response. So we can check it. We can make sure this is correct. You know, and we can replay it. So if I want to replay this again, so this one, this time we asked for value type, right? So if I replay this, and it's going to come back and hit the application. So this replaying is independent of the application. You can modify the code, you can rerun the application, and then hit replay in the Ngrok UI. It'll provide that request back to your application in the same format with a post or a get or whatever. And you can keep doing that till you've cleaned up and made your thing work, you know, parsing or logic or whatever you might want to do to make it work. And you've not gone back and through the whole Alexa deal or the Azure monitor deal. And Azure monitors, you know, they don't fire events right away. They take sometimes 5-10 minutes between alerts. So it's not like you can sit there and wait, twiddle your thumbs and hope that the monitor will fire when you need it, right? So that process is very tedious. And that's where the Ngrok comes into handy. Now, of course, you can use Postman too. It's not like Ngrok is the only way. You can take this whole JSON and, you know, use Postman to post this JSON to this URL there, or, you know, local, either localhost or the external URL. So it's not that you can't do that with Postman, and probably you should do that. So you save them the different requests to that. So it's not dependent on the execution of your Ngrok. As I said, if you shut this thing down, then this loses all the data here, right? Because this web app is running inside of this console app here. All right. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you guys have enjoyed yourselves. I hope you learned a few things. If you have, please give me a thumbs up, and I will see you next time.